Welcome to Crack This Case, a podcast discussing and examining the mysterious and suspicious, the unlawful and unsolved. Here now is your host, Sharon McHenry Power.
Thank you for joining me in today's episode, part 2 of The Bride-to-Be Who Never Was, the story of 27-year-old Cynthia Jane Miller of Beckley, West Virginia, and the one night the devil in the flesh came calling and saw to it that she would never celebrate another birthday nor her wedding the following evening. 37 and soon to be 38 long years have now passed, and Cynthia's killer still walks amongst us, weaving their way through our neighborhoods and communities, living the life Cynthia was denied. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, if you haven't already listened to Part 1, it would be a good idea to go back and do that before listening to Part 2. Part 1 contains important information, details, and facts that will enable you to understand everything we discuss here today. As we discuss and examine the mysterious and suspicious, the unlawful and unsolved, perhaps you will be the one to crack this case. Episode 2, The Bride-to-Be Who Never Was, Part 2. Before we begin to dissect and examine the information, timeline, and possible suspects from Part 1, let's take a moment to review what happened to Cynthia on the night of August 26, 1981, just hours before her wedding the following day. The tragedy that befell Cynthia and the then small, quiet community of Beckley, West Virginia, was a day that forever changed this friendly, trusting community and the neighborhood surrounding 103 Miller Street, where the body of Cynthia Jane Miller was found in the living room of her very own home, lying on her stomach just 2 feet from the front door by her fiancé, Gary O'Neill, a police officer in the nearby town of Leicester. Gary told the police he had been visiting his parents that evening in Princeton, West Virginia. Princeton is an approximate 45-minute drive from Beckley. Gary said he was going over there to go over final plans for the wedding for the following day. According to Gary, Cynthia had planned on going with him, but changed her mind at the last minute so she could complete her Avon customer orders. Aside from teaching, Cynthia was also an Avon sales representative. She wanted to complete bagging her orders and possibly delivering them as well, so she wouldn't have it hanging over her on their one and only wedding weekend, nor as she was preparing for her new job as math teacher at Park Junior High School that would begin 3 days after their wedding. When repeated attempts to telephone Cynthia from his parents' home to tell her he was going to be later than 11 o'clock p.m. and getting back went unanswered, Gary became very concerned and left Princeton at 11:30 p.m. Gary also stopped several times along the way to telephone Cynthia. Remember now, this was a time when there were no cell phones. Every time Gary wanted to call Cynthia, he had to pull off the road and find a payphone, usually found either at a gas station or a convenience store, driving back home to Beckley and arriving at 12:30 a.m. As he opened the front door to the house at a tad past 12:30 a.m., he found Cynthia lying just 2 feet inside the door, brutally murdered to an almost unrecognizable state by 4 gunshots from a .25 caliber automatic handgun. 2 shots were fired at very close range, approximately 22 inches away, one hitting her in the shoulder and one hitting her in the throat. These were non-fatal wounds. The 3rd and 4th shots were fired at point-blank range, meaning the gun was touching directly on her head. The shots were fired into her ear, and she was also shot on the top of the head. These shots were both fatal wounds in which the state medical examiner, Dr. Irvin Sofer, and the county coroner, Dr. Jamel Ahmed, both said that Cynthia fell into an immediate coma and died within 30 minutes. It was a heinous, up-close, and personal kill. The time of death was determined to be at approximately 9:30 p.m., Thursday, August 26, 1981. There was no forced entry into Cynthia's home. Nothing was disturbed in the home. There was no robbery, and there was no sexual assault. Her murderer left nothing behind. No bodily fluids, no hair, no blood, no fingerprints, no footprints. It's as if the killer just vanished into thin air. Or did they? What if Cynthia's killer already lived in the house, making for a great explanation as to why their hair, fingerprints, or even bodily fluids would be present? And of course, no fast escape would be required. A theory which the police tend to gravitate toward is that Cynthia answered a knock to her front door, and knowing or being acquainted with the individual, innocently opened the door for the person and was immediately shot due to a hate-filled vendetta against Gary. Cynthia was killed as payback. After the first 2 shots, the killer walked just a mere 2 feet inside for the fatal slaughter. With this scenario, it could explain the lack of physical evidence at the scene of this monstrous act. The killer simply wasn't inside the home, beyond 2 feet from the front door, to leave anything behind pointing in their direction. On this horrifying evening, why didn't any of Cynthia's neighbors hear anything? It was only 9:30 at night, hardly the time when most adults are in bed asleep. Why didn't the neighbors to Cynthia, such as Essie Starr, see or hear anything? Or the neighbors directly across the street? Or the neighbors just a little bit up the street like Hattie Wickline? Why didn't any of them hear the gunshots? But yet, a resident, Barry Webb, living a street over from Cynthia at 405 E Street, did hear the gunshots at 9:30 p.m., although he stated to the police at the time he thought they were firecrackers. If you remember from Part 1, an anonymous caller also telephoned the Beckley police station with a report of hearing firecrackers or gunshots at 9:30 p.m. as well. Could Barry Webb and the anonymous caller be one in the same? And what does that mean? Well, we'll get to that a bit later on. The most puzzling question, though, of all is why didn't Cynthia's tenant, Terry Boland, hear the loud gunshots when she was in the very same home at the very same time that Cynthia was murdered? So many questions. Cynthia's case has been one of little to no clues or evidence. No rhyme or reason as to why anyone would want to hurt Cynthia. She had no skeletons in her closet whatsoever, and she was respected and loved by all who knew her and all whom the police have spoken to in the years since her untimely death. Cynthia was a truly good person who lived and walked in her Christian faith, and she had a winning and kind personality. Why would anyone want to harm her, to kill her? There have been a few suspects since the murder in 1981, and whom, after all these years, still remain on police radar. But there has been nothing of substance to bind either of them to the murder. The investigators throughout the years have said that these two suspects are one who Cynthia knew, and the other is someone who lives in the community and had been at Cynthia's home sometime earlier on the evening of her murder and asked to speak to her fiancé, Officer Gary O'Neill. Now, concerning this detail, I really want to know where this information came from. Did a neighbor see this individual at Cynthia's home on the evening of her murder, and this person knew who this individual was? Did Cynthia by chance and for some reason mention to someone earlier in the evening that an individual had come by looking for Gary? Could she have mentioned this in passing to her Avon manager while the two were talking on the telephone? Could Cynthia have mentioned this to her tenant, Terry Boland, when Terry arrived home that evening? After all, Cynthia had to let Terry into her apartment because for some odd reason, Terry's key would not open her apartment door. Terry did tell the police that when Cynthia was helping her in, she was talking enthusiastically about her wedding and mentioned Gary being in Princeton. So maybe she did mention this detail as well. These are the only possibilities I can think of as to where this information came from. It is a significant piece of information to know that someone did go to Cynthia's home the night of her murder. But whether this has anything at all to do with Cynthia's death is just another question in the unknowns to this difficult case. From the onset of researching this case, I have been plagued with so many questions. I will admit that I don't necessarily buy into the vendetta against Gary theory, but yet I don't dismiss it as a possible theory either. It's also important to remember that Cynthia had no reason for anyone to harm her, making the vendetta theory very plausible. I realize the police have not released all the information, but still, it just seems that after 37 long and agonizing years of hard work, there would be something to tie this individual to Cynthia's murder. After all, there has to be a strong reason for the person to be a suspect in the first place. And yet, investigators have said repeatedly over the years that no evidence as of yet binds either of these individuals to the murder. Is there even such a thing as the perfect murder? I would like to think not. But I do believe there is such a thing as convoluting evidence and hindering an investigation with lies that cannot be proven as lies, and thereby confuses the timeline and provides false alibis, to name just a few. Even though it is an excellent and very probable theory, could it be possible that throughout the 37 years, too much time has been placed on the vendetta theory? I do know the Beckley police have considered and investigated numerous theories in the past 37 years, but they always come back to Cynthia opening the door to someone who had a vendetta against her fiancé. Investigators believe that this killer focused their hatred and payback on taking away the one thing that Gary loved most in all the world, Cynthia. If this scenario truly is what happened, well then, to commit this vindictive evil act the night before their wedding was chosen deliberately and was like icing on top of the cake for this diabolical slime bag of a monster. There is no doubt whatsoever that this is a personal attack of hatred. When considering the vendetta theory, it's understandable that with Gary having been in law enforcement, it's possible he could have made some enemies. Or another angle could be a personal reason, such as a soured relationship from his past. He did have an ex-wife in which they had 2 children together. And of course, there is the possibility of a former girlfriend who didn't like the way things turned out. So it is possible that someone did have a vendetta. But then I have to question, if this individual was suspected of this horrible crime and did have a deep hatred of Gary and blamed him for whatever it was, so much so that he or she would kill Cynthia to get back at him, wouldn't Gary know who this individual was, or at least have some idea of who it might be? Gary lived another 33 years after Cynthia's death. He passed away in 2014 from cancer. But during all those 33 years, I would think that if Gary knew of someone who had a vendetta against him, he would want to get justice for Cynthia. It just seems logical that he would tell the investigators who he suspected. And, well, perhaps he did. And that's why the Beckley police have always considered this their number one theory. In regards to Gary O'Neill, he was a Vietnam veteran. He was a police officer with a certain sense of fearlessness, as is expected of anyone in law enforcement. He was in love and just hours away from the happiest moment of his life, his wedding and marriage to Cynthia. I cannot see this man caving to fear or silence if he had any idea who the monster was who did this to the love of his life and destroyed his own happiness. I haven't come across anything indicating that Gary involved himself in finding this murderer, so I have the feeling that if Gary had any knowledge of who this individual could be, he would have dedicated his life to bringing this individual down. From the beginning of the investigation in 1981, lead investigators with the Beckley police, Billy J. Cole and Frank Pack, considered, of course, that Gary may have very well been the person who ended Cynthia's life. They investigated his statements and whereabouts on the evening of August 26th and cleared him of any involvement in Cynthia's murder. Throughout what will be 38 years in August since Cynthia's death, Generations of investigators have combed through the massive amount of files and information and have found nothing to contradict the original investigators' findings. I have faith in the Beckley Police Department. They have never given up on Cynthia's case. With that being said, I believe other avenues need to be seriously considered at this point in time. I do have a few questions about Gary, so let's discuss a few of these, starting with those individuals living in Cynthia's home, of which Gary was one of them, and Terry Boland was the other. According to Gary's statements to the police, on the evening of Cynthia's murder, he arrived home from work at 7:00 p.m. He and Cynthia talked about their wedding while Cynthia worked on her Avon orders. At 8:20 p.m., Gary left for his parents' home in Princeton, West Virginia, while Cynthia decided to stay home bagging her customers' orders. Now, this detail in the timeline is where I have a difficult time understanding Gary's actions. Why on the evening before their wedding did Gary find the need to drive all the way to Princeton to discuss the wedding plans with his parents, when the most convenient and logical thing to do would be to just pick up the telephone and call them? It wasn't necessary to drive 45 minutes all the way to his parents' home and then 45 minutes back to Beckley. It just doesn't make sense to me. I find myself asking, was Gary up to something that evening? Did Gary really go to his parents? Yes, there were a few telephone calls made from his parents' home to Cynthia's home, but that could have been anyone making those calls. It could have been his mother or his father. Now, a large reason Gary was dismissed as a suspect was because of these telephone calls. But there is no way of truly verifying who made those calls. And I want to know, were the telephones Gary used each time he said he stopped along the road to call Cynthia, were they dusted for fingerprints? Were the telephone records pulled for review? I also wonder why Gary would even stop along the way if he was in such a hurry to get home to see if Cynthia was all right. This pulling off the road to stop and call Cynthia takes away precious time. If it were me, I'd be driving like a bat out of hell to get home as fast as I could. I wouldn't be stopping to make phone calls that only prolonged the time it took to get home. So why even stop? And if he was so worried, why didn't he just make one of his calls to his police colleagues and have them perform a well check on Cynthia? It was also 8:20 p.m. when Gary left for Princeton. This is a late time to start out for a 45-minute drive, and then a 45-minute drive back home to Beckley, and telling Cynthia he would be back home at 11:00 p.m. What was the point in this visit to discuss wedding plans with basically no time that could be spent with his mother and father when, as I mentioned before, he could have just telephoned them? It really does make one wonder why Gary would make such a decision. He also was not home by 11 p.m. as we discussed in Part 1. In all the research I have done, I haven't found any information on witnesses that may have verified Gary's statements he made to the police concerning he and Cynthia that evening from 7:00 p.m. when he arrived home from work and 8:20 p.m. when he left for his parents' home. Nor do I find any information on witnesses who could actually verify that he got home at 12:30 a.m. Of course, his mother and father were his alibis in that he was at their home and left around 11:30 p.m. But not even that can be verified by anyone other than his parents. I would feel more comfortable knowing that someone other than his mother and father could be his alibi for that certain period in the timeline. There is another observation concerning Gary. It may be a small detail to some, but to me it sticks out like a sore thumb. When we drive our vehicles, it's natural to assume that the driver would be wearing shoes, especially a police officer, as Gary was, who should always be an example of safe driving habits. Although driving barefoot is not illegal in any state, it is frowned upon by law enforcement because bare feet can cause your foot to slip or slide off the gas or brake pedal. Vehicle control can be compromised. I can't imagine Gary O'Neill, an officer of the law, driving barefoot either. So why was he barefoot when he ran outside to direct the emergency medical team and the police to the front door and inside where Cynthia's body lay? Gary had found Cynthia immediately upon opening the front door. A so-called normal reaction would be to immediately assess what was happening and if Cynthia was all right. So why was he barefoot if he had just arrived home from a 45-minute drive? Does it seem logical to you that he would waste precious time by taking his shoes off to render aid and CPR? In just a mere 5 minutes, I cannot see Gary, or anyone for that matter, driving 45 minutes home, getting out of the car, walking to the front door, opening the door, seeing Cynthia lying on the floor, rendering CPR, calling for an ambulance and police, and during all that time deciding to take his shoes off. That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Did he really drive barefoot from his parents' home? I don't believe he did, because, if you recall from part 1, Gary told police that he had stopped several times along the road to call Cynthia. So who walks around barefoot at a gas station or a convenience store, where these payphones could almost always be found? In regards to human behavior, nothing is impossible. But the probability of Gary being barefoot when he arrived home is not likely. Now, on the flip side, assuming he did have his shoes on when he opened the front door to Cynthia's home, why were they off 5 minutes later when the ambulance and police arrived? For whatever reason then, his bare feet were noticed by the medical team. Now, this is an extremely short time. 5 minutes. When emotions are high, he is supposedly panicking, and then in this midst of turmoil, he just flips his shoes off? Now, the reason I even bring up about Gary being barefoot is because being barefoot in our homes is a sign of comfort, of being relaxed, taking it easy. So in a scenario where Gary had his shoes off, this could very well mean that Gary was home earlier than he stated to the police, therefore having the time to get comfortable and relax. Needless to say, in this case scenario, it possibly could mean that Gary was home at the time Cynthia was murdered, and if so, was he involved? Also, I think it good to note here, Gary did tell the police that at first he thought Cynthia was just playing a joke. Now, why he thought that Cynthia would lay down on the floor pretending to be hurt or dead, I don't know. And then Gary stated that the thought flew through his mind that Cynthia may have broken the vow they had made to one another about no drinking before the wedding. But why would they even have to make a vow like that to one another? We know from all the police reports, family, friends, Cynthia didn't drink at all. So why in the world would Cynthia suddenly decide to pop open the bottle of alcohol Gary said he had purchased for them to celebrate together and just drink all by herself? I have to admit that, well, I find these statements of Gary's to be questionable. What do you think about all this? I also have to question how Gary would even have the time to come up with all these thoughts. We're talking about a matter of minutes in a crisis situation. I don't know why Gary would make these things up. I'm also not saying that he lied. But it's very hard to believe that Gary would have ever thought Cynthia would be playing dead on the floor of her living room the night before her wedding, when she was so busy getting things ready for that wonderful celebration she was looking so forward to. And it's even harder to believe he could ever think she would open a bottle of alcohol and drink by herself. Some of Gary's actions and his statements do bother me. Also, by all accounts of family, friends, and all those who spoke with Cynthia on the day of her murder, she was so excited for their wedding and becoming Mrs. Cynthia O'Neill, which leads me to believe that Cynthia did not in any way have a change of heart again, like she did on 2 previous wedding dates they had set. By all accounts, Cynthia appeared thrilled with anticipation for their wedding the following day. Cynthia was also wearing a t-shirt she had made that had "The Summer of '81, You and Me" printed on the front. Although there are some questions as to Gary's statements and actions, by all accounts of those who knew him, Gary loved Cynthia very much and was very excited for their wedding day. Because I have been trying to piece together the overabundance of baffling information, and because of all the questions I keep coming up with that just creates more questions, as well as the different varying scenarios that keep turning around in my little gray cells, I have come up with yet another scenario. I don't believe Gary was involved with another woman, but that's not to say that something didn't happen to cause some kind of turmoil the night before their wedding that Cynthia didn't even know anything about. Let's take a moment to think about this. What if when Cynthia had canceled their wedding date 2 times prior to their date of August 27th, Gary became so frustrated, so disappointed, so hurt, and maybe even a little angry, that he lost his senses and had an impulsive act of unfaithfulness. In this one time, this one moment of infidelity, he enraged his fling who had already been smitten with him, maybe even had a past relationship of sorts with him. And this individual became so irate, so angry, so enraged when he turned his back and planned to marry Cynthia, when he realized she truly was ready this time to go forth with their marriage. Now, if this individual had any type of problems, such as emotionally or mentally or even drug abuse, this could cause an individual to commit such a heinous act of murdering Cynthia in revenge to get back at Gary, to hurt him in the worst possible way, to eliminate what this person perceived as their competition. In this theory, the individual could have been a former girlfriend or someone whom Gary had known a while but had no other feelings for other than friendship, but she had much stronger feelings for him. Maybe this individual lived in Cynthia's home. Of course, I'm only speculating on these various scenarios, and by no means am I pointing the finger and accusing anyone. Ideas and speculation can lead to other theories that could be examined, and of course, this is a part of what investigations for the police are all about. Whether Gary was involved in Cynthia's death in any way, innocently or otherwise, is unknown right now. There are a lot of questions that need answered, but it's difficult because Gary is no longer here to answer them, nor to be re-interviewed by the new generation of investigators. The police have always believed that Gary was not involved in Cynthia's murder, based on the interviews conducted with him and his statements from 1981 that he continued to repeat until the day he died. I'm no police investigator, but from an outside view researching the case, I can't seem to dismiss Gary as a person of interest or suspect based on some of his questionable actions and statements we discussed, and as well, in my opinion, the lack of any alibi other than his parents. Currently, the Beckley Police Department's Cold Case Unit have reiterated that they are open to considering other theories as well as suspects. This would include any additional theories of those who were interviewed and questioned in the original investigation. What are your feelings on Gary O'Neill? Now let's discuss the other person living in Cynthia's home, Terry Boland. Now Terry Lampe by marriage. And that's Lampe spelled Lampe. Of those connected to Cynthia, Terry Boland's account of August 26th is the most puzzling of all. According to what Terry told a newspaper reporter the day after Cynthia's death, she had lived in Cynthia's home for a little over a year, and that wanting her privacy, she made it a point not to be too friendly. I don't know about you, but I find that statement rather arrogant, snobby, and all I can say to that is possibly Terry Boland wasn't too friendly to begin with. I mean, really, who wants to purposely be unfriendly, especially to someone as nice as Cynthia, who was also Boland's landlady? I certainly would want to be friendly to the person I rented my apartment from. I wanted to bring this detail up because it does say something about Terry's attitude with Cynthia. I can't help but wonder what Cynthia thought of her not-too-friendly tenant. I also wonder how Terry came to rent Cynthia's apartment. In Part 1, I talked about her father, Joe Boland, who was a state trooper and chaplain with the West Virginia State Police. Since Gary was a police officer, perhaps he knew Mr. Boland, and that's how Terry came to rent the apartment from Cynthia. Did Terry know Gary prior to his relationship with Cynthia? And if so, what was their relationship? These questions are all important in establishing the relationships between people connected to Cynthia. Let's now take a deeper look into where Terry was and what she was doing on the night Cynthia was murdered. According to what Terry told the police, she had returned to her apartment from visiting her parents at 8:30 p.m. This was exactly 10 minutes after Gary had left the house at 8:20 p.m. Terry had her own private entrance to the apartment in the back of Cynthia's home on this particular evening, and for some odd reason, Terry's key to her apartment wouldn't open the door, and Cynthia had to let her in. Isn't it odd that of all times for Terry's key not to work, it would be the one night Cynthia was murdered in her home? Could it be that Terry picked up the wrong key? Could Cynthia's killer at an earlier time been messing around with the lock? trying to get into the house and damaged the cylinder? Could someone have taken the key without Terry's knowledge to make a copy and then returned the wrong key? Terry's key not working could be an important detail. On the other hand, it could be just a coincidence. To me, though, the whole key situation is just too odd, too coincidental. It just keeps nagging at the little gray cells in my head. With all the many questions we have concerning the twists and the turns and the difficulties of Cynthia's case, I did send in a Freedom of Information Act request, and I received a rapid response, but unfortunately, there was absolutely no information whatsoever on public file to send to me. I don't exactly understand that, but I'm going to assume it's because it's still an ongoing, active, open case. There are other statements Terry made that I find so hard to believe. That's not to say they aren't true. It's just so unbelievable. Let's talk now about some of the other things Terry told the police. She said she heard Cynthia's footsteps in the laundry room just a little bit past 9:00 p.m. on the night Cynthia was murdered. My question is, how could these possibly be Cynthia's footsteps in the laundry room? Cynthia was upstairs talking with her Avon manager on the telephone from 9:00 p.m. until 9:20 p.m., as verified by telephone records. There is absolutely no way Cynthia could be in two different places at the same time. There were no cell phones or cordless phones in 1981 that would enable Cynthia to walk and talk freely, going from one room to another and from upstairs to downstairs. So how could Cynthia have been down in the basement laundry room if she was upstairs talking on the telephone? Obviously she couldn't. Were the footsteps maybe Terry's imagination? Or even possibly an intruder? Or could she have been making this all up to create a confusing timeline for the investigation? Now, if she really did hear these footsteps, it does point toward what could be a possible intruder gaining access into Cynthia's home by taking Terry's key without her knowledge. This intruder went on to murder Cynthia and either staged the scene to look like Cynthia was shot as she opened the front door to someone, when in fact this monster took Cynthia by surprise in her living room. Cynthia was either facing toward him or her as they approached, or she turned and faced her killer when she heard him or her approaching, and was immediately shot from a distance of 2 feet to her shoulder and her throat. Being that these first 2 wounds were non-fatal, she was in some way able to try and make an escape toward the front door, but fell to the floor on her stomach due to pain or even possible blood loss. The killer, hungry for her death, knelt down and placed the gun on Cynthia's head and fired the 2 fatal shots in her ear and on the top of her head. It doesn't sound too far-fetched that it could happen this way, does it? If we are to assume Terry's key not working is no coincidence, and that she indeed did hear footsteps that in no way could be Cynthia's since she was talking on the telephone, then this intruder theory can certainly explain the mystery of the key not working and the footsteps. However, None of this explains how Terry could hear the light shuffle of footsteps in the laundry room, but yet not hear 4 loud gunshots right above her in the living room. Of all the puzzling statements Terry made to the police, the most troubling is that Terry didn't hear any of the gunshots. The first reaction when hearing that is a raise of the eyebrows and the thought, how could that possibly be when she was in Cynthia's house at the same time the 4 gunshots were fired and killed Cynthia? Now, it's easy to jump to conclusions and say it's her, she did it, she has to be the killer. And it's difficult to find a reason as to why Terry Boland didn't hear any of the 4 gunshots when she was right there as it was happening. The question as to why Terry didn't hear any of the shots is not only baffling, but it creates a certain confusion to this case, and perhaps that's exactly what Terry wanted. That is, if she was involved in any way in Cynthia's murder. As I discussed in detail in Part 1, the Beckley police in the original investigation were so perplexed with Terry's claim that they performed a sound test firing a .25 caliber automatic handgun from upstairs in the living room in the exact location where Cynthia's body was found, while several other investigators were located downstairs in Terry's basement apartment. The investigators in Terry's apartment reported that all 4 gunshots were very loud and heard very clearly. They also reported that from Boland's apartment, they don't know how anyone could sleep through the loud gunshots. Also bear in mind that Terry was not wearing any headphones, nor was she listening to any music that would prevent her from hearing any loud gunshots. The thought that the washer and dryer could be too loud is not an idea I tend to gravitate toward at all. Both the washer and dryer in Cynthia's home were located in the basement. Terry's apartment was in the basement, but the washer and dryer were all to themselves in a separate room. So could Terry not have been telling the truth? And if so, why would she place herself in the home at the very same time Cynthia was murdered? Was she intentionally creating confusion in all her statements? Every statement Terry has ever made just creates more confusion, more questions, and more possible theories. Now, on the flip side, to be fair, there could be the possibility of the killer going to great lengths in using a suppressor or silencer on the small .25 caliber handgun, or the very remote possibility that Cynthia was murdered elsewhere and brought back to her home, staging it to appear she was killed there. Finally, in regards to Terry Boland, there is something very peculiar she did after Cynthia had been murdered. We learned in the prior episode that Terry claimed her father called her on the telephone, waking her up at 11:30 p.m. Okay, so she does wake up to this telephone call, but not 4 loud gunshots? Like I said earlier, everything Boland says presents not only confusion, but also doubt in the validity of her statements. Also, when investigators first questioned Terry, they noticed there was a vent in her bedroom. It was at that time Terry mentioned that sound traveled from upstairs through the vent and into her apartment. Through the vent in her apartment, she could hear conversations that took place upstairs. Doesn't this make her statement that she didn't hear any of the gunshots from upstairs all the more bizarre? Gunshots are a lot louder than voices. Now getting back to the phone call Terry received from her father at 11:30 p.m. She told police that her father had called because his car had broken down and he needed her to come and pick him up and drive him home. She quickly threw on some clothes and left her apartment at 11:40 p.m. Terry told investigators she returned to her apartment at 1:00 a.m., but noticing all the police and the ambulance at Cynthia's home, she decided to just turn around and drive to her mother's home. Now, oh boy, if I were in this situation, I can't even begin to imagine not wondering what was happening in the very home in which I lived, or stopping to ask the police if Cynthia and Gary were all right. But Boland? She didn't even stop to ask one of the numerous officers there on the scene what was going on. She just turned her car around and left. Do you find this behavior as odd and bizarre as I do? Could it be she didn't have to ask about anything because she already knew what happened? But then, why even drive back to the house? Just to turn around and leave if she already knew. Was Terry there to verify for herself that something had gone down as planned? Every action taken and every statement made by Terry the night of Cynthia's murder and the days after are nothing short of strange, peculiar, odd, confusing. Now, it could be argued that Terry became frightened when seeing the police cars, and the ambulance at Cynthia's home. This was where she lived as well, and perhaps she suddenly felt a sense of danger and didn't want to go anywhere near the home. Yes, it would be quite startling to come home to such an active and scary scene. But the question still lingers. Wouldn't that chaotic scene make you want to know what was going on since it was also the place you lived? Wouldn't you want to ask one of the officers what was happening? If there was one place to be safe on that night, it would certainly be right there at that moment where every police officer in town was gathered, certainly safe enough to inquire what had happened. No matter how many times I think on Terry's actions of just turning her car around and zooming off with no questions asked whatsoever, I just find it more than odd. It makes me feel suspicious of her. I don't have any information at this point on whether Terry's phone records were checked to see if indeed she received an incoming call at 11:30 p.m. from her father on the night Cynthia was murdered. If she did, how did he make this call if he was stranded on the road? As we know, there were no cell phones in 1981. Did he walk to a gas station to make the call? And how could a call from a payphone or landline at the gas station or wherever actually be verified as coming from her father, unless perhaps there were surveillance cameras, which wasn't exactly a safety procedure practiced by many businesses in 1981? Again, so many questions. Let's assume that, yes, Terry's telephone records were checked, and it was confirmed that an 11:30 p.m. call came in from her father. The point here is, no one could know what they talked about unless you were a fly on the wall. Maybe it was about picking him up, or maybe it was about something else. There is no account of any eyewitnesses to Terry leaving at 11:40-ish to get her father the night of Cynthia's murder. So how does one, including the investigators, even know that Terry really did leave the house? Just as Gary's alibi was his parents', it appears Terry's alibi for a particular period of time is her father, the state trooper. It would be a more solid alibi for Terry were it someone other than a parent. After all, some parents would do anything to protect their child, even if that protection was for a very wrong and bad reason. I'm not saying this is the case by any means, but it is something to think about. Does it even matter that Terry would need an alibi from 11:30 p.m. onward, the evening of Cynthia's murder? Well, it does, if the state medical examiner concluded there was a possibility Cynthia could have been murdered any time later than his original conclusion of 9:30 p.m. And again, as I discussed in Part 1, he did finally consider a later time of 9:30 up to midnight when asked by baffled investigators questioning the 9:30 p.m. time of death, since Terry Boland claimed she heard no shots at that time. They believed that Terry not hearing the gunshots could be explained if indeed she had left to pick up her father, and it was during the time she was gone that the murder took place. It almost seems as though the investigators were looking to fit the pieces of the puzzle around Terry not hearing the gunshots, and the only way to do that was to conclude that Cynthia died later than 9:30 p.m. and after 11:40 p.m. And of course, it would be beneficial to Terry if the police believed Cynthia's murder occurred after she had left. In the many hours and months that I have put into researching Cynthia's case, I found that Terry, whom I mentioned earlier, is now married and goes by Terry Lamp, left West Virginia not long after Cynthia was murdered. And lo and behold, Terry now lives right here in Georgia, just about an hour and 45 minutes from Atlanta, where I live. It would be interesting and beneficial to hear Terry's account of the night Cynthia was murdered and hear her thoughts about all of it. I'm sure she doesn't like being a subject in any murder case. Who would? But the reality is, she was there. She may hold the missing piece to this crazy, baffling puzzle. Let me know what you think on all this information on Terry Boland. I would like now to briefly discuss an interesting person in the mix of all these twists and turns. Barry Webb, Cynthia's neighbor who lived at 405 E Street, which ran perpendicular to Miller Street where Cynthia lived. I first came across Barry's name in a 1981 newspaper article where he spoke with a reporter just days after Cynthia's murder. He piqued my interest in the storyline of this confusing case, so I decided to just dig a little deeper into Barry. At the time of Cynthia's death, Barry was approximately 41 years old. He was married, and records show his wife's name was Peggy. They had a son in 1975. And it appears they had other children as well. Barry lived in a pretty red brick home with one side facing Miller Street. From his kitchen window in 1981, Barry could see directly onto Cynthia's property and her home with no obstructions, because Cynthia's neighbor across the street from her, whose house also backed up to Barry's, had an empty lot or side yard that enabled Barry to fully see over to Miller Street and Cynthia's home. The day after Cynthia's death, the police questioned all the neighbors around Cynthia's home on Miller Street and also those who lived on nearby streets such as E Street where Barry lived. In Part 1, I detailed what Barry had told the police. On the evening Cynthia was murdered, he heard what he thought were 4 loud firecrackers at 9:30 p.m. The Beckley police logically surmised that the 4 firecrackers Barry heard were the 4 gunshots fired into Cynthia's body. They concluded that most likely Barry Webb was an ear witness to Cynthia's murder. Also, the day following the murder, Barry told the investigators and a newspaper reporter that he looked out his kitchen window to see what was going on, but it was just too dark to see anything. If it hadn't been so dark, Barry said, I could have seen something if there was something there to be seen. The first shot was low, while the other 3 shots I heard were loud. As I studied the various photos and maps where Barry Webb lived and Miller Street where Cynthia lived in 1981, it's very clear that Barry could see Cynthia's entire front yard, the side yards that go down into the backyard, as well as the entire front and sides of the house itself. Because Barry had a full view of Cynthia's front and side yards and home, he could see almost all the comings and goings right from his kitchen window. Now, the reason I mention Barry Webb at all is because I find it very curious that he was the only one of all Cynthia's neighbors that heard the gunshots. He wasn't even Cynthia's next-door neighbor. Cynthia's next-door neighbors didn't hear anything, nor did anyone else on Cynthia's entire street. Yet Barry Webb did, and he didn't even live on Miller Street. I then think of the anonymous caller to the Beckley police station who reported 4 firecrackers or gunshots also at 9:30 p.m. on East Street at the top of the hill on the Fayette Street side. Now, why could this be important? Well, Barry Webb lived on the very same street where the anonymous caller reported hearing firecrackers or gunshots at 9:30 p.m. As I've pointed out before, this is also the same time Webb said he heard them. So I'm thinking it could be very possible the anonymous caller inadvertently stated hearing the location of gunshots or firecrackers as on E Street, which was actually the street where the caller lived. Webb lived at 405 E Street. This bit of information presented to me yet another possible theory into Cynthia's murder, that Barry Webb was the anonymous caller. He was setting up a sort of alibi for himself, in the sense that if another person reported hearing gunshots at 9:30 p.m., it would make his claim of hearing the same thing at the same time much stronger, since 2 ear witnesses can be significantly more believable than just one. Perhaps he set the 9:30 time as a smokescreen to cover up the actual time of Cynthia's murder, which, as I discussed earlier, could have been between 11:45 and midnight, while her tenant Terry Boland had left the house. This could explain Terry's claim of hearing no gunshots whatsoever. By setting the sound of gunshots at 9:30, it undoubtedly brings Terry smack dab right in the middle of Cynthia's murder. A frame-up pointed like an arrow to a target on Terry Boland. So who had a full visual of Cynthia's home to possibly see that Gary had left the house at 8:20 that evening? Who could have possibly have seen a visitor coming to Cynthia's home that night? Who could possibly have had a sight line down the side of Cynthia's house to see Terry Boland driving away at 11:40 p.m.? Well, a possibility could be Barry Webb right from his kitchen window. Could he be involved in Cynthia's murder? In considering this theory, what would be the reasoning behind such a heinous act of violence? Well, we certainly don't know beyond our own conjectures. There could be many reasons, just like the many reasons for Gary O'Neill, Terry Boland, or others. As far as Barry Webb, perhaps a possible infatuation, an obsession with Cynthia, and he became angered she was getting married. Barry did remark to a reporter in regards to Cynthia, she was a real pretty gal, kind of bubbly-like. The remark of her being a real pretty gal could very well be just an innocent remark, but something about it has never sat too well with me. A long shot, perhaps far-fetched idea could be that Cynthia had some kind of damaging information on her neighbor Barry that could be detrimental to his marriage or even his career. There are so many imaginative and possible theories as to a possible motive that would make these scenarios work, while at the same time, there are many reasons as to why Barry Webb could in no way be considered a person of interest. To this regard, we must remember also that the state medical examiner concluded that Cynthia's death occurred at approximately 9:30 p.m. on August 26th, but he also allowed for some leeway on the plus side when the investigators expressed their confusion over Cynthia's tenant not hearing the gunshots. Dr. Sofer said it was remotely possible, however very unlikely, that Cynthia's death could have been between 9:30 and midnight. Because both the state medical examiner and the county coroner came to the conclusion that Cynthia's time of death was at 9:30 p.m., and that Dr. Sofer, the state medical examiner, weighed heavily on the side that 9:30 was the time of death and no later. Well, then this supports Webb's claim of hearing 4 gunshots at 9:30 p.m. Again, there are so many possible theories that it makes this case seem impossible to solve. The bottom line is simply that after 38 years come August 26th, of Cynthia's murder being unsolved, it's time to consider that anything goes, and to even look into those who were originally interviewed and those who would be considered highly unlikely to commit such a horrific crime, because there's always a possibility that some piece of evidence or clue has been overlooked. It happens. Barry Webb's statements to the investigators and putting himself out there commenting to newspaper reporters after Cynthia's murder, has, I feel, placed himself in a position where he has to be somewhat considered in the investigation process and in this episode's discussion and examination into Cynthia's murder. There is one other individual I would like to discuss in brief. Cynthia's former husband, Michael Lando Cole, whom I discussed in depth in part 1 and detailed their relationship. The information I have is that Michael was dismissed as a suspect in the original investigation. But then again, so has anyone close to or acquainted with Cynthia, it seems, that we know of. And here it is, 2019, and the murder is still unsolved. Because of this, I need to mention Michael Cole, because he had been a major part of Cynthia's life at one time. In regards to Michael, the unanswered question as to why Cynthia divorced him still lingers. I feel it had to have been something pretty significant, since she was so devout in her Christian faith and believed that marriage was forever, and was devastated with their marriage coming to an end. According to numerous newspaper reports, Cynthia and Michael were able to remain friends after their divorce. But how do we truly know this to be a fact? We've all heard or read stories where an ex-spouse goes off the deep end, so to speak, when their once significant other has moved on, found someone else, and plans to marry. Did Michael have any built-up resentment in regards to the divorce and in Cynthia's upcoming marriage, in which he violently acted upon in a sudden surge of anger? In any case of murder, it's common knowledge that a current or former spouse is the first to be considered as a possible suspect. Michael no longer lives in West Virginia. He resides in North Carolina and has for quite some time. Michael's older brother, Eddie, who has since passed away, and Eddie's family were living in North Carolina when Michael decided to relocate there and join him in his business, the Cole Electric Company. I do think it's important to know why he and Cynthia divorced. Hopefully, I'll find the answer to that and include it in an update at some point. I want to mention that in 2011, the Beckley police received a letter concerning Cynthia's murder from an incarcerated man in California. This letter led the investigators to another individual, but unfortunately, the individual died before they had the opportunity to really ask any questions. The police have never disclosed this information from the incarcerated man or who the individual was they were directed to. Whether any of this has any relevance to Cynthia's case, and in considering the two suspects they have had on their radar from the very beginning, is unknown. In concluding this episode, I would like to end with some of Diana's, this was Cynthia's sister, her comments on how Cynthia's murder changed their family's life forever and how the lingering heartache and pain was present every day of her parents' life and her own. The family was devastated. Diana said that Cynthia was very close to their parents, and especially their father, whom she was very much alike. Their father, Francis Miller, was overwrought with grief and so devastated that someone killed one of his daughters that from that day forward he slept with a loaded shotgun beneath the bed for fear that someone would harm him. When clearing out Cynthia's home, they found a tape recorder where Cynthia had recorded herself playing the piano and singing hymns. Their father would sit and listen to Cynthia's voice over and over and over again, tears falling from his eyes. When Diana would bring her daughter to visit, Francis Miller would take out Cynthia's tape and play it for his granddaughter so that she would hear and know her Aunt Cynthia's beautiful soul through her voice. Every time he would play Cynthia's tape, Diana said he would be so heartbroken. Diana remembers her sister as being so full of life, a smile that would light up any room, such a happy person, intelligent, talented in so many ways. Diana also describes her sister as being a rose God placed on this earth to make the world a more beautiful place. Retired Detective Frank Pack, who was one of the original investigators, says he still remembers the daily visits of Cynthia's father to the police station. Every day he would come looking for answers, and every day he left empty-handed. It was the saddest thing. This went on for years until one day he just stopped coming. Then I learned he and his wife had moved to Florida, where their daughter, Diana, and her family lived. You know, police don't give up. Families don't give up. I hope the suspect knows we don't give up. It's in the hands now of the next generation of police officers, and it will be solved. Now, to the monster who took the life of this amazing young woman, I hope you're listening to the words of Frank Pack, of Detective Sergeant Morgan Bragg, and all the other investigators who are on your tail. Because you see, the advancement of forensic science technology and genetic genealogy has caught up with you. Your days in the sun are running out. This ends our episode of The Bride-to-Be Who Never Was, the story of Cynthia Jane Miller. If you or anyone you know has any information, no matter how small you think it may be, please contact the Beckley Police Department in West Virginia at 304-256-1720. If you feel more comfortable reporting anonymously, you can do so at Crime Stoppers of West Virginia. Their number is 304-255-1720. 7867. Be sure to give Crack This Case a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcast. This is a wonderful way to show your support because it helps the show reach more people, and that's exactly what we need to spread awareness of every unsolved case. Be sure to tune in every other Tuesday for a new episode of Crack This Case. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and enjoy the love and good times of family and friends.